All right, this is a summary of the article on word study fallacies by Benjamin J. Baker. You have the option of watching the video or reading the article. You are welcome to do both. There's more detail in the article. The purpose of this, of the material, of the information, is because you're going to be learning how to do word studies. And word studies are really, really powerful and helpful, but they also have a huge potential to be misused. So I am going to show you a whole bunch of different ways that word studies get misused. And hopefully it's something that if you continue to use word studies, you can revisit regularly to verify that you're being responsible with word studies, because we want to interpret correctly, and languages work in some ways and they don't work in other ways, and there's some pitfalls that people often fall into when they're using word studies, and I want you to know about those. Okay, so we have 7 basic fallacies that Benjamin Baker gives us, and there are different ways that those fallacies can sort of manifest themselves. So each fallacy has several different examples. So we're going to look at them. I'm going to move kind of quickly. A lot of it, well, it's very detailed, but it's important. And if there's just one thing you take away from the whole PowerPoint, is that you have to be careful. You have to be really, really careful and be responsible with word studies. So the first fallacy is called the basic meaning fallacy. This is the assumption that every word has one basic meaning that exists in every context in which it's used, and words just don't work that way. One way that sometimes manifests itself is there'll be a word, and then people think that every word that has that root in it has to be somehow related to that basic meaning. Now, if we look, it doesn't even work that way in English. For example, the word awe means wonder. And whereas the word awful used to mean full of wonder, it doesn't anymore. And so in the English language today, the word awful no longer has to do with wonder. So if I say this food tastes awful, it would be a mistake to assume that I am just full of wonder at how amazing this food is. Language doesn't work that way, and Greek and Hebrew are the same. This is specific to Hebrew. It might be less relevant to you until and unless you learn Hebrew, but it's important just to know the ways verb forms and language forms work. So Hebrew has a basic verb stem that's called kal, and there's another verb stem which is called hifil. And when you take the kal stem of the verb, we often think of that as the basic meaning of the verb. It isn't always, but when you're first learning Hebrew, that's what you get told, because a lot of the time it is. And then when you change the stem and make it a hifil form, that is used to say they caused something to happen. So I build a house, but maybe the king causes the house to be built. And that is one way that the hifil verbs work, but it doesn't always work that way. And hifil sometimes gets used for other purposes. So the point is, in Hebrew grammar, just like the grammar of all languages, it's more about context than about some mathematical equivalency, and it can't always be translated woodenly. So not that these grammatical words mean anything to you unless you've studied Hebrew, but hifil isn't always kal plus causation. I want to go back and a couple other examples. This was an English example, but we see it in in Hebrew and Greek as well. So the Hebrew word for war has within the word the root of the word bread. But we can't say that the Hebrew word for war has anything to do with bread. The Greek word for apostle, apostolos, comes from the verb apostello, which means to send. But that doesn't mean that every time an apostle is mentioned, that that apostle, that she or he is being sent somewhere. Okay, another example of the basic meaning fallacy. The English dictionary doesn't give Hebrew or Greek word meanings. And so one way we can see that is when we look at the word head in English. It can mean a body part or head. It can mean the top of something, the head of the column. It can mean your brain. You have a good head on your shoulders. And it can mean a leader. He's the head of the company. And there's other meanings for the word head in English as well. Now, the Hebrew word that we translate head is rosh. And in Hebrew, rosh can mean this. It can mean the top of something. It can mean the height of something. And it can also mean a leader. But notice that it doesn't mean brain. The ancient people thought about our bodies very differently, and they didn't all think that thinking happened in the brain, in the head. And then in Greek, kephale is the Greek word for head. It means this. It means the top part, and it also means the source of a river, but it doesn't mean the leader of a company. So you see that you can't look up head in English and think that the word rosh or the word kephale has all the different meanings that the English word for head has. Again, language doesn't work that way. So that's the basic meaning fallacy. Then there's the etymological fallacy. Etymology is the history of a word. And so the etymological fallacy mismatches different time periods for the meaning of a word. So one way the etymological fallacy happens is when an older meaning is brought forward. This is one of my favorite examples in English. Years ago, the word nice meant picky. So you might say to your friend, I'm having him over for dinner, but I'm worried about what to serve because he's so nice. And what that meant was he was so particular, persnickety about what he was going to eat or what he was going to wear or what he was going to, whatever it is. But nice doesn't mean that anymore. Nice means kind. So we can't read a text that was written in the present day and think that nice means picky, because it doesn't anymore. So the way we see that, for example, in Greek is hamartia at one point meant missing the mark. At the time the New Testament is written, it means sin, and it no longer means missing the mark. So we can't import that old meaning into its present meaning. Same thing with ecclesia. Ecclesia at one time was related to being called out, but that's not what it means by the time the New Testament is written. So we can't say that the church is the called out ones. Doesn't work that way. We can also get into trouble with compound words. Sometimes people say, okay, here's this word, and I'm going to figure out what it means by looking at this part and this part and putting them together. And that doesn't, sometimes that works, but sometimes it doesn't work. My favorite example in English is butterfly. We are not going to understand the word butterfly better by looking at the word butter and then looking at the word fly. And the same thing is true with, for example, overhang. Now, overhang kind of works, right? An overhang on your house is where the roof maybe hangs over the walls. But if we put them together the opposite way and we have the word hangover, a hangover doesn't have anything to do with something sticking out over a roof, right? And so just like in English, in Greek and Hebrew as well, sometimes a compound word's meaning is the sum of its parts, but it isn't always. We can do the opposite rather than taking an older meaning and bringing it forward. Sometimes people take a later meaning and read it back into an earlier text. So two examples, one example in English is that years ago, the word nephew used to be used for grandson. Nephew could mean the children of your brother and sister, but it could also mean the children of your children. And so it's not okay to take a meaning today of the word nephew, so the son of my brother or sister, and insist that an older text that used that word must mean the son of my brother and sister like it does today, even when the context maybe really clearly says it means grandson in that older text. The word hashmal means electricity in modern Hebrew, but in the Hebrew Bible, Ezekiel 1:4, it obviously can't mean electricity in that text. The New Testament, we have the word episkopos. It's sometimes translated bishop, but we didn't have bishops. The church didn't have bishops at the time that the New Testament was written, so we can't think of a structured church the way it developed later on and read that office of bishop as it later developed back into New Testament times. Really, the same thing is true of all of the words for roles in the church, minister, elder, things like that. It's hard to know exactly how the very early church was creating their organization. And so we can't take what we have today as our church organization and assume that the words that we translate, minister, deacon, elder, bishop, had exactly the same meaning back then, because those offices didn't exist. Let's see. We also have to be careful of etymology in other languages. Now, sometimes this is necessary. There's a really fancy word that I'll give you that you learn, everybody learns it in seminary. It's called a hapax legomenon. Hapax legomenon is a fancy way of saying a word that only occurs once in the text. And it's really hard to figure out the meaning of a word that is only used once in the whole Bible. And sometimes, particularly in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, scholars figure out the meaning of a Hebrew word that isn't used anywhere else by looking at languages that are close to Hebrew. So sometimes that's Arabic, and sometimes that's an ancient language called Ugaritic. But Ugaritic, we don't have a ton of Ugaritic texts. So sometimes Ugaritic can be helpful, but sometimes not. And so sometimes it is necessary to look at other languages to try to figure out the meaning of a word that only occurs once in the New Testament. However, we have to be careful of etymology in other languages. I don't know if you've heard this, but dunamis is the Greek word that means power. And of course, dunamis in Greek eventually became our word dynamite. And I've heard pastors preach about the word dunamis in their sermons and claim that the power it's talking about is an explosive power like dynamite, but that is taking the related word in a different language and also from a different time period and reading it back into a perfectly ordinary Greek word that just means power. So we have to be careful of those kinds of things. Okay, next fallacy is the swamp water fallacy. I don't know if you know what swamp water is. My kids used to love to do this. It's when you go to a fast food restaurant where you're going to help yourself to pop, and the kids always wanted to make swamp water, which meant take their cup and go get some Coke, get some root beer, get some orange pop, whatever else, lemonade, mix it all up, and they called that swamp water. And so the swamp water fallacy is taking a number of different meanings of a word or information from contexts where that word is found and suggesting that it's all relevant for understanding the word's meaning in a particular context. The Amplified Bible can lead to this kind of fallacy. I like the Amplified Bible, and I find it really helpful to look at a word and think about all the different things it could mean in that context. However, that doesn't mean that that one particular word has all of those meanings in that context. That's a fallacy when we make a word mean all of its possible meanings in one place. So a couple of ways the swamp water fallacy shows up. The limitations that the context puts on the word in one place doesn't necessarily apply to another. So for example, Ezekiel 11:2 talks about men who give wicked counsel in this city. And then Psalm 1:1 uses the same word when it talks about blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. So we have counsel in both places. And the first example in Ezekiel is counsel in the city. And so sometimes you'll see somebody saying, well, that means that wicked counsel happens in the city. And therefore, when Psalm 1 says, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, that means you should avoid cities. No, in Ezekiel, it's talking about cities. In Psalms, it's not. There's nothing there about cities. So you can't take the limitations imposed by the context in one place and think it means exactly the same thing in another one. Another way that the swamp water fallacy shows up is that meanings in many contexts can't be jumbled together. So you might know the word agape. In Greek, the verb form is agapao. And agapao sometimes means God's kind of love. So Ephesians 5:2 and Luke 6:35 talk about either God's self-giving love or human beings who are supposed to imitate God's self-giving love. But Luke 11:43 says that the Pharisees agapao. And 2 Peter 2:15 says that Balaam agapao gain from wrongdoing. And obviously the love that's being talked about in Luke 6:35 or Luke 11:43 and 2 Peter 2:15 are not the same kind of love. So we can't say, oh, it means God's kind of love here and here, so therefore it must mean God's kind of love everywhere else. And then, like I said, all the meanings of a word don't apply in one context. One of my favorite examples in English is the word grill. We can grill a hamburger. We can grill a prisoner. I can tell you that I'm going to detail my grill this weekend. And it doesn't all mean the same thing. And I'm not going to tell you that you want to come over this weekend, I'm going to grill hamburgers, and you are not going to wonder if I'm not only going to cook the hamburgers, but I'm also going to ask them a bunch of questions. You're not going to wonder that, because we know when we use a language a lot, we know that we don't take all the meanings of a word and jumble them together into one context. And Hebrew and Greek work the same way, so we have to be careful. So the Greek word phino means to appear or to shine. And in Matthew 13:26, the servant sees that suddenly weeds have appeared in the field. But we can't then kind of bring in the meaning to shine also. The most reasonable meaning for the word in that context is that the weeds appeared. And it's not that the servants could tell the weeds appeared because they were shining. We don't have to try to shoehorn that other meaning of the word in there as well. The fourth fallacy is the lost in translation fallacy. This is assuming that a word's range of meaning in one language will be perfectly matched by the range of a word's meaning in another language. We kind of saw that with the word head in English and in Hebrew and in Greek. But a couple other ways that it shows up. So the Septuagint translates the Hebrew Bible, but the Septuagint was written in the 3rd to 1st century BC, but the New Testament was written in the 1st, maybe the early 2nd century CE. So we can't assume that just because a word translates a Hebrew word in the Septuagint, that when that same Greek word is used in the New Testament, that it also means the same thing as that Hebrew word. A really good example is the word hilasterion in Greek. It does, in the Hebrew Bible, it is used to translate mercy seat. And so some people assume that in Romans 3:23 to 25, it refers to a mercy seat. But the problem is hilasterion can mean several different things. It means several different things even in the Septuagint, but it also means several different things at the time the New Testament was being written in other places in Koine Greek. Koine Greek is the specific kind of Greek that the New Testament is written in. It means other things. And so we can't assume that just because in one place in the Septuagint, a Greek word is translating a certain Hebrew word, that then when it's used in the New Testament, it also means the same as that Hebrew word. So just because a Greek word was used to translate a Hebrew word in the Septuagint doesn't mean that same Greek word, when it's used in the New Testament, means the Hebrew word. Another lost in translation fallacy is one-to-one correspondence. That's the idea that one word in Greek or Hebrew always means exactly the same word in English. So one of my favorites is the word pistis in Greek. It means faith, but it can also mean loyalty or faithfulness. And we have to look at context and figure out which it means in a particular context. Another way lost in translation fallacy shows up is that the English dictionary doesn't give Hebrew or Greek word meanings. And so I seem to have used this example twice, but head in English means body part, top part, brain, or leader. Rosh in Hebrew means body part, top part, height, or leader. And kephale in Greek means body part, top part, or source. But it doesn't, we can't see that, oh, the English word head translates Rosh in Hebrew, and then think that Rosh means all the things that head does in English. It doesn't. We have the sea of synonyms fallacy. This is the idea that words can overlap in meaning without being fully synonymous. So partial synonyms exist. One example is that the same people in the New Testament are called apostles, but they're also called disciples. So in some ways, those two meanings overlap, but they're not exactly the same. Two different words can be translated. The gloss is the English word that it's translated into. So two different Greek or Hebrew words can have the same translation in some places, but still have a different range of meaning. So the word pneuma means breath, and the word pnoe means breath, but pneuma can also mean spirit, whereas pnoe can't mean spirit. So two different words, they can mean the same thing, but they don't necessarily always have to. And then we also have words with different range, but have the same meaning some of the time. So the word yad means hand, and the word safa means lip. And they obviously have different meanings in one sense. But in Daniel 10:4, it says, on the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the Yad of the great river, that's the Tigris. And so here, Yad, the word that sometimes means hand, in this case means the bank of the river. But then a couple paragraphs later in the same book, or a couple book chapters later in the same book, Daniel 12:5, the book says, then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood, one on this bank, Lisfath, and of the stream, and the other one on that Lisfath of the stream. So one on this lip of the stream and the other on that lip of the stream. So here we have two different passages in Daniel, and two different words are used for the same meaning, what we translate in English, the bank of the river. So even though they have a different range of meaning in Daniel 10:4 and in 12:5, they mean the same thing. Finally, here we have Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry has parallelism. So if you're doing Hebrew poetry, be sure and pay attention to the parallelism in your passage. Here's an example from Psalm 22:10. On you I was cast from the womb, and from the belly of my mother you've been my God. So the word womb and the word belly are two different words in Hebrew, but they are used as synonyms here. Now, you have to be careful, because on the one hand, it's a fallacy to take two words that are almost the same but not quite, that are used in parallel like that, and argue in great detail for differences in meaning, because usually Hebrew poetry is making parallels and treating the words as synonyms, even if they're not exactly synonyms. But also, sometimes Hebrew poetry will add a line that changes the meaning just a little bit. So you have to look at context and figure out, here I think they're synonyms, and here I think there's some nuance going on. And then there's contextual amnesia. This is the failure to recognize that every user of a language is free to make use of the entire range of a word's meaning in different contexts. So one way that contextual amnesia shows up is you can have the same author using the same word, but using it with a different meaning. So Mark in Mark 6:41 writes that Jesus looked up. And then he uses the same verb in Mark 10:51 for the blind man. And it says, Rabbi, Jesus asks him, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man says, Rabbi, let me. And if we felt like the same author had to use the same word with the same meaning, even in a different context, we would feel like we had to translate it, Rabbi, let me look up. But that same Greek word can mean recover my sight. And so here, obviously, from the context, the blind man says, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. Another way contextual amnesia shows up is that different authors can use the same word with different meanings. So the word kletos means to be called, but when Paul uses it, he means if you're called, you're also saved. So, for example, in Romans 1:5 and 6, he talks about you who are called to belong to Christ Jesus. So these are believers. But in Matthew says, many are called, but few are chosen. So for Matthew, just because you're called, it doesn't automatically mean you're a believer. So different authors can use the same word with different meanings. And then I don't need this here. This is a mistake, so we're going to go right past that. Then you have you are what you speak fallacy. This is the idea that language constrains thinking. Now, this was a popular idea among linguists about 100 years ago, and it was believed that the way your language, whatever your mother tongue was, that that language that you speak the best organizes your thinking and prevents you from thinking some things and constrains you to think other things. That has been disproven. Now linguists believe that language can shape thinking, but also that thinking shapes language. And so the reason that language changes over time is that people need to begin to use language to talk about new things. And also people are creative and they want to find new ways to talk about new things or old things. Think about the language that young people use. Think about all of the new technology that sprung up in the last 150 years, let's say, and all of the new vocabulary that had to be invented to talk about those new things. If language constrained our thinking, we would not have been able to think up a computer because there was no such thing before that, and our language would have prevented that. Language does shape our thinking. It is the lens through which we view the world, but it's not hard determinism. It's much softer and more malleable than that. So the two common ways that this fallacy shows up is some people talk about Greek thinking versus Hebrew thinking based on language. That's not a thing. And another way to see that is that English speakers distinguish kinds of snow, even if we only have one word for it. Now, you might have heard the myth that Inuits have, and the number differs, 9 different words for snow, 50 different words for snow. It seems to be that it's more complicated than that. First of all, there's more than one Inuit language. And second of all, they have a root that refers to snow, and then they change the root in order to refer to different kinds of snow. But we don't have any problem talking about packing snow or a dusting of snow or dry snow or wet snow, heavy snow. We find ways to talk about the different kinds of snow, even if we only have one word for it. So you can see that our minds are capable of distinguishing kinds of snow, even if our language isn't obviously adapted for that. So it's complicated. All right. So hopefully, as I said, the main thing I wanted you to get out of this is that we have to be careful with word studies, and that just because you've found out that in a particular text, there's a certain Hebrew word or Greek word that is being translated into a certain English word, that you can't then take that information and use it everywhere else in the Bible. Language is complicated, and if you want to learn all of the ways that it's complicated, learning Greek or Hebrew is a great way to understand the Bible better. It doesn't answer the questions that we always hope it's going to answer. It tends to bring up more questions, but it also helps you ask better questions because you understand the language. That's it, and I hope this is helpful. Send me an email, of course, if you have any questions.